Are you ready to do this, buddy?
Let's do it.
Eh, Uh, I don't know if this is working. I have no idea
It
if
says it's
the
live.
intro worked or not. So I don't think anybody's connected right now. But yeah, man. So today we're going to talk a little bit about spawning season, what me and Caleb Konrad have found out about spawning here in Texas. For those that are tuning in now, remember you're listening to the Bass Kayak and Beers podcast. This is the real life with your host Armando, and today Caleb is joining me. Remember, if you are watching on YouTube or watching on Facebook, feel free to share, comment, let us know where you're watching from. Also, if you are listening on our MP3 format on the recording, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Amazon Music, we really appreciate it if you can give us your 5-star reviews. It does help out with the growth of the podcast. So, anyways, so Caleb and I are going to be talking about spawning here in Texas. Caleb used to work for Douglas Rods, the company that I partnered with for rods. So, Caleb, thank you so much for coming here, man, and hopping on the show.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
How's life in Texas treating you? I know you moved from upstate New York to Texas a few weeks ago, almost a month ago, maybe some more.
Uh,
How do you like in
it
Texas bass here?
it's been about 3 months now. I think it was like early
3 months. Okay.
November when I first moved down here. But dude, I love it down here. I mean, the people are so nice. Food's great. Fishing's great. Weather's great. I mean, I have no complaints whatsoever. I've really been enjoying my time down here so far, and it's a lot different. The fishing down here is way different than back home in New York, and so all the experience I've been able to gain just in the 3 months I've been here already has been super valuable, and yeah, I'm loving it.
Catching new PBs here in Texas compared to upstate New York?
Yeah, we're slowly getting bigger and bigger. I'm still searching for that true giant, that double digit, but my biggest largemouth is now tied for my biggest smallmouth, so I got that going for me.
Yeah, you're not gonna get the smallmouth that you get used to in upstate New York. I'll tell you that right now.
Yeah, for a while there, my biggest smallmouth was for like 3 years. My biggest smallmouth was bigger than my biggest largemouth.
Really?
Yeah,
You see, it's a give and take. I wouldn't trade Texas bass, but I mean upstate New York and some of the areas over there where you have those Susquehanna River, where you have those big brute smallmouth bass that fight like crazy, then that's a very tempting trade for
yeah,
sure.
but you guys have spotted bass down here, which are they're kind of pretty similar in my opinion to smallmouth. I mean, the way they act and the way they fight, they might not get quite as big as a smallmouth up there, but their habits are pretty similar, I would say.
Yeah, there it is. That's a good thing about Texas. It has a wide range of bass here
Yeah,
that
for sure.
we enjoy fishing. But anyways, dive into this. You and I have been really working hard. Sometimes we go on your boat together. Sometimes I'll be on my kayak. Sometimes you'll be on your boat. But we really working hard on trying to get better at what we call pre-spawning and spawning here in Texas. And I know it's probably very different from New York, in upstate New York, especially. I'm sure we're further along the pre-spawn and spawning time than you are in New York. Usually, what time by when do you in New York start to get those spawning bass?
Yeah, it's the pre-spawn in New York is probably, I would say, my favorite time to fish up there, and it's a lot different than it is down here for sure. Like right now in New York, there's still ice on all the lakes most likely, and I would say the biggest difference right off the bat is as soon as the ice gets off the lake, even when that water is still cold in upstate New York, like those big bass, they get up shallow quickly. Like even when the water is still in the mid to high 40s, those a lot of those big females are already pushing shallow. Whereas down here, from what I've seen already in the last few weeks, these Florida strain largemouth, that water's really got to get up there for them to want to think about going shallow. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about our experience on Ray Roberts. You know, what was that, last week or 2 weeks ago?
Yeah,
And when we launched the boat and I saw the water temperature was still 48 and a half, 49, I knew right off the bat like we were, it was going to be a tough day and we weren't going to catch them shallow, because from what I've been seeing down here is the Florida strain largemouth, until that water gets into like the mid 50ish range, they're not, like, you might get one stray one here or there, but the vast majority of those fish are still going to be out deep in their winter holes.
definitely. Yeah, and it's one of those things like you mentioned. You might get a nice one here and there, but it's hard to put like a good string of bass when it's that cold here in Texas. Let's talk a little bit about the pre-spawn, and we can go back and forth about what we found on pre-spawn. Your experience fishing Ray Roberts and whatever other lakes that you fished, this pre-spawn was really short this year. It was almost no existence. Right now, we are in the midst, most lakes, not all lakes, and we'll talk about the differences in lake. But a lot of lakes right now are already into full spawning season. Um,
Yeah,
it's crazy.
I think it really varies, depending on what lake you go to, and even a couple hours away. Like where I mainly fish Lake Ray Roberts, based off what I'm seeing and what I've read online, it's one of the last lakes in Texas to where the fish spawn, just because it's so big and so far north. It takes a while for the water to warm up. And those fish out on Ray Roberts right now, from what I've seen, are there hardly any of them are even shallow yet. I mean, the pre-spawn hasn't even hardly started out there. But I mean, you and I, we took a trip down to Fairfield this past weekend before it closed, and down there it's a completely different story. It almost seems like peak spawn on that lake, you know, where, and the water temp is a lot higher. It was already 60, 61 by Monday out there, which is kind of like that prime temp, it seems, down here when those fish start thinking about really getting up there. So I think it really varies based off what lake you're on. I think a lot of the bigger lakes are still, the pre-spawn hasn't even hit yet. I think some of these smaller lakes that are a little bit further south, they're getting right into that peak of the spawn right now. So I think it just varies like crazy.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things that we notice in the differences, like for example, I was fishing, you were fishing Ray Roberts, you and I fished Ray Roberts one time, um, and I was fishing also Lake Belton, which is it's an interesting lake. It's there's quite a few lakes that are similar here in Texas. Whitney Lake comes to mind, but it's one of those lakes where it's really rocky. It's kind of like a canyon, right? It goes deep. It's like 50, 60, some places get up to 100 feet. And then you see all this limestone rock everywhere. And you just, there's really very few places where there's any grass in it. In my experience on, especially fishing over the last 2 weeks in Belton, is on the pre-spawn you can see them moving up from the main lake into those finger creeks. Not all the way to the back, but they were starting to move. And now the temperature was somewhere in the 58 to 62. That's temperature range that I found into those creek arms. And where I found them, where I caught them was it was really interesting. It was three major areas and all three major areas lead you to believe there's it's like staging areas for spawning bass. One of them, for example, was a secondary point leading into a little cove slash creek, and you can see them and you can catch them on like the points, especially where there was timber at. You know, if you see a point and at that point you see standing timber, it's if, especially it's a secondary point at this time of the pre-spawn, that's money.
Yeah.
That's mostly when I caught him. I also caught him at the main creek channel on standing timber, and that was that was more like the ones that I'm assuming are going to be further along the lines of spawning. Those are probably the last ones that are going to spawn. And then the other area where I found him was brush piles and standing timber up in 5 feet flats. And to me, those are the ones that are going to start spawning first. So those are the three major areas where I found him. I found him other spots, but those where I caught the majority of it. And you can see the difference in where they're where they're staging and the faces at where they're spawning because they're not gonna all spawn at the same time. Some of them are gonna be closer, they're gonna spawn first and the other ones, and then God knows how many groups. But it was very interesting to see at that lake at that temperature where they were at. You know, offshore points, secondary points, main creek channels, and then flats along the creek where they would spawn. And then we go to Fairfield, which is a completely different lake. And that was same temperature, somewhere in the 58 to 62s. And the water level is, I mean, that lake is a lot shallower compared to Belton Lake. And there's no rock formations, there's no rocky shores. It's just grass, and that's it, and a little bit of standing timber on the south. And in that lake, there were just full blown spawn, like most of the and I was amazed. February 27th, we went. This is the last day before they closed Fairfield, and they were already spawning. The vast majority of the bass, like they were spawning beds everywhere. You even caught what was it, like a 4 or 5 pounder that already dropped their eggs?
Yeah, I caught a I caught a 5 pounder that already dropped its eggs, and a 7 pounder that already dropped its eggs as well. I caught a couple good ones. Um, yeah, I think honestly, I think the biggest misconception that people have when they analyze the spawn is that all fish spawn at once, and I think the spawn is a very drawn out, long process, no matter where you are in the country. So to us, like we saw these beds all over the place, and like we're calling it peak spawn, but I mean, that lake could just be so freaking loaded with fish. That could have just been the first wave of fish that were pulling up. And even though there's beds everywhere, it to us it was like, oh, it's peak spawn, but that might have just been the very, very beginning of it. I mean, kind of one thing I noticed was the very last hour of our second day out there. We ended up finding some pre-spawn fish there right at the end that were still in the creek channel staging to go up, and I'm sure there's still some pre-spawners that are sitting out there in 25-foot water right now too. So no matter what time of year it is, especially when it's this early, you're always going to have fish in all three stages. So especially during the spawn, I think when you go out, you kind of have to keep an open mind and let the fish tell you. Like when I went there the first day, I thought it was going to be all pre-spawn. I didn't think there was going to be a single one on beds. And then as my day progressed and I kept, putting the pieces of the puzzle together, it wasn't until like 1 o'clock when I realized that like these fish I was catching shallow were spawning fish, and that's because the sun came up and I was able to actually see them. And I realized that a lot of these bites I was getting shallow were fish that were spawning. So then I was able to go like cue in on that a little bit. I can't hear you for some reason.
My bad. I
Oh, there it
apologize.
is.
So one of the things that I think, like you mentioned, biggest misconception is this is something that I've learned myself as I've grown into my abilities to catch bass, and is that just because they're spawning bass doesn't mean that's the only way you're going to catch them. Like
Yeah.
Fairfield was a perfect example. We were in the morning looking for those spawning bass. We found them. We caught them. We had a great morning. Well, had a great morning. You had a so-so morning, but no, but we
I
we
lost a lot of them.
we we really concentrated on those spawning bass because there were so many bets. But as the day wore on and those bass were getting hammered because, like we were talking about, you and I at the lake, that Fairfield was raped and pillaged that weekend. I mean, people were just catching bass, which, by the way, it's illegal, putting them live well and taking them to their home lake. And it was funny because I caught a 6.5 pounder right in front of another boat, very nice gentleman. And he actually asked me if he could keep the bass so he can take it to Richland Chambers because he's a, a fishing guide there and he wants those prize bass at his lake because it helps them, especially if he remembers where he released them. By the way, if anybody's listening, watching, thinking of that, that is actually illegal here in Texas. I mean, certainly anybody's going to find out what you're doing, but you could get in trouble for moving fish from one lake to another, from what I understand.
Yeah,
But the point about it is like,
I'm pretty sure it's illegal in almost every state,
yeah,
but it's one of those specific scenarios where I don't think the state police were caring about, or the conservation officers, because they kind of understand, like they kind of I think side with the fishermen in this scenario
yeah,
in a way. But obviously, I mean, you don't want to spread diseases around. But it was funny because the big one I caught, there was a boat too that he said the same thing. He was like, "Man, why'd you throw that back?" And for me, man, when I'm fishing for bedding fish, I'm treating them with the most respect I can. And I'm like, my picture I put up is terrible because I just want to get that fish back. I was by myself. I'm not going to sit here and and keep it out of the water for 5 minutes to make sure I get a good picture for Instagram, because I just don't care about that. I care about, even though the lake's closing, I'd rather see that big female go back, get on her nest, protect her. That's one of the biggest fish in the lake. You want to make sure her babies grow up and also become good big fish.
Yeah, I've always thought, and we were talking about this the day we're at that day in Fairfield, whether it's a tournament or for social media content. I don't want a bass to die on my watch because I took too long taking pictures and post. It's not worth it. I
Yeah,
don't care how many likes you get. You get it. I mean, if you can tether them and keep them alive, and give him a second, then take him back and take more pictures if you want. But even then, you try to put those fish back, especially on bedding. If they're spawning, just put them back as soon as you can. I get we want the pictures, we want the hero shots, we want the videos, we want the reels, the stories on Instagram. But when you're done, just make sure you get that fish back in the water. You don't want to. We don't want blood money here. But one of the things that going back to that scenario is once we figured out, okay, this bedding bass have been hit with a 3/4 ounce weight for the last 2 or 3 days. And they're not biting anymore. We actually shift to looking for pre-spawners, and then we move into coves where you can see that we're on grass and further out of the bedding area. So, and we had great success with that too. So that's one thing. If you're new to this and bass fishing, just because you're targeting spawning bass, if that's not working out, don't think the other bass is not gonna be eating as well. You can still find them, especially on a lake like Fairfield with the high population of bass.
yeah, yeah. And a quick side note on that, people that think that life scope is ruining the sport. I spent a lot of time in 2 days looking at bass that would follow my bait, literally touch it with their nose, or act like they're going to eat it and then turn around 360 and not eat it. I did catch some on it, but it's not like some secret tool that's just you're gonna put on your boat and magically you're gonna catch all these fish. Yes, it's a very valuable tool, and there's a lot of guys out there that are showing how valuable it can be, but you got to put the time in to learn it, and it's not a guarantee, and you can waste a lot of time too. I learned that at Fairfield, where you're looking at these fish and you seeing them all day. You could see 100 4 pounders that come up and look at your bait, but if not one eats it, then you didn't catch any of them. So it can lead you astray too.
That's a good point, because that turned out to be fool's gold in a way. Because remember, we were trying to catch them with the jerkbait. We saw them following the jerkbait. We saw them nosing it, but they just wouldn't bite it. And then we figured, okay, would you just have to change the cadence, change the color? And we kept trying, and we spent a good 3 hours doing
Yeah,
that. And then we gave up on it, and then we just started throwing senkos and Texas worm and Texas rig creatures, and all of a sudden we were starting catching a ton of bass. You caught like 3 bass in the last 15-20 minutes while we were there.
yeah,
And it that's a good point that you're saying. It could really ruin your day if you are all of a sudden just locked in on what you're seeing on live scope. Well, all this bass are just dying for you to put a Senko in front of them to tore it up, and you're just like, oh no, I want to catch him on live scope. So there is, technology can serve in a way, but it also can cost you money on a tournament if you were just kind of like unwilling to change. And that kind of happened to both of us at Fairfield. We're just like, no, they're nosing it. We just gotta make one little adjustment, and we'll get on him. And that adjustment never came. As much
yeah.
as we tried. And then come to think of it, the only thing we just had to ditch the live scope and fish with our instinct. And all of a sudden, we started catching them. Another thing that I noticed on spawning that I've never noticed before, and I'll pick on some of the cues that I found, and you can pick up on some of the ones that you found. But one of them that really caught my eye. First of all, spawning bass on reeds, they only, from what we saw, they were only spawning on the green reeds. Like we were up north on Fairfield, where close to the dam, those coves that are full of reeds, and you can see beds, like hundreds, thousands of beds everywhere. Like every 3 feet, you'd see a bed. And then we went south when the water was a little bit more murkier, and the reeds were just, for whatever reason, were just completely brown. They were not rich and lush like in the north end. They were not green. They were not healthy. They were still in that winter phase where they're just trying to survive winter. and we didn't see a single bass spawning in those areas. And I thought that was interesting. I thought, like, okay, check mark. This is something that I've now learned. If I'm looking for spawning bass, look for the reeds that look the healthiest, the ones that are emerging in their spring season instead of the ones that are still trying to hang on to make it through the winter.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about that, and I think there's probably a couple different reasons for that are not necessarily because of the reeds themselves, but because of some other factors that cause the reeds to be alive or not. For one thing, is the water temperature. I think obviously the reeds that were more green, lush, and alive, the water was a little bit warmer up there, and we found that obviously that the water was like in that 60 to 61 range by the second day up there where we were catching all those spawning fish, and then down at the other end, it was still kind of hanging on in that 58, 59-degree range where they were all dead. And then the other aspect of that too is if there's dead reeds, I mean, that's probably going to suck some of the oxygen out of the water. And if I was a bass, I wouldn't want to spawn in water that had no oxygen. I don't think that would be a very good habitat for them to lay their eggs, as opposed to nice lush green vegetation that might actually be putting oxygen into the water.
Yeah, that's a good point. You picked up on other cues as well, and I want you to talk about it. One was the difference between how you would find spawning bass in like upstate New York to where you found them here. You want to touch on
Yeah.
that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm definitely not an expert on the spawn down here yet because this is my first time ever fishing a spawn down here in Texas, or really in the South in general. The furthest south I've ever fished for spawning bass until this year was like the Potomac River, I would say. And in the north, usually for largemouth, they like to spawn like on something, like on a piece of structure. Like they, if there's like a log or a lay down, something like that, or a dock, that's typically where they like to spawn in upstate New York. And they definitely like hard bottom too, like a good sandy bottom, good, a little bit of rock even mixed in with the sand. That's usually where you're gonna find largemouth up there. But I think the structure is kind of the key. Whereas down here, from at least what I saw in Fairfield, I mean, they were just spawning on the reeds almost exclusively, and it didn't matter if there was like you'd see a perfect like stump right there next to the reeds from the spawn on, and there'd be no bed there. Instead, there'd be a bed just randomly, next to the reeds with no cover. And that was one thing that was definitely way different that I wasn't used to. I mean, we even tried fishing a bunch of stumps, mainly in the south end. So maybe they do spawn on those stumps, and we just hit it too early. I don't really know, but we didn't find a single fish spawning on any of those stumps. And if I was back in New York, I would have thought that they'd be on the stumps and not necessarily on the reeds.
So yeah, and that's a good information nugget right there. Because of course, if you're talking about some lake like Belton, like I was talking about earlier, when I went to fish there, there's really no grass there. Very few spots. Travis Lakes, lake similar to Belton. Lake Whitney, lake very similar to Belton. Now, those lakes don't have grass, so obviously they're gonna spawn wherever there's laydowns and stumps. That's different. But when there is the option of bass on grassy lakes and reeds and stumps, it seems like, at least in Texas, from what I've learned, and I'm not an expert, is they prefer those grass patches. Those pockets of you see that white rock on the bottom, and then right hugging up the reeds, which is a little bit harder to fish because now you really have to flip it without making too much noise right on top of them, because you can't cast past them because they're right up hugging the reeds. And generally, if you throw them right on top of the beds, they'll spook. That's where usually a weightless Senko comes in handy, because you just flip it right there. It's not going to make a lot of noise, and you can smack them right there. But that's an interesting point. I didn't know that in New York they were more like looking for stumps rather than grass. Here in Texas, they look for grass and reed more than they look for stumps. And it
Yeah,
kind of makes sense if you think about it. If they're protected by reeds, they're a little bit better protected, because now they're surrounded pretty much on one side. Like only half, only 50% of their beds are exposed to predators or anything, or the outside.
yeah,
Versus if you're on a trunk, you only like 15-20% of that bed is actually protected by that trunk. So kind of makes sense that they will look for reeds more than trunks. But I thought that was really interesting as well.
Yeah.
What other things that you seen on
Um,
spawning here that you noticed
yeah.
that caught your eye?
One thing I'll say that's actually a similarity to pretty much spawning fish I've seen anywhere in the country, like back home in Northeast and down here, is while we did see a majority, like almost all the fish shallow, there were none of the big ones were up there. Like it's the same thing back home. Like if the biggest ones, the big females, like the 5+ pounders, the sevens, the eights, the nines, in my opinion, they like to spawn deeper, and that's like the 1 7 I did catch off the bed. She was off the bank. I don't know exactly if she was on anything. I was fishing, I was catching all these 2 to 4 pounders up shallow, and I looked down right next to the boat. And my boat was sitting in about 8 feet of water, and I saw just a tiny little light patch, and I was like, "That's a bed right there," and flipped to it, and she bit. And it's the same thing in New York, and especially with smallmouth too in New York. The big fat female smallmouth, they always are in deeper water. Like it's just like they're smarter. They know if they go like super shallow, number one, they're gonna get targeted by fishermen. And I have a feeling it's evolutionary where like they know that like a
Yeah.
bird or something could potentially, come after them or come after their young. And so I think that evolutionary, like there's something in them that tells those like super trophy class fish to spawn deeper. So that was one thing I saw. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
No, that's a good point. And it applies to, when you think about it, it applies to all kinds of creatures, right? Even humans, like a young toddler is more, what is it, more conditioned to venture out and get himself run into traffic, or or put himself in harm's way, or go pet a dog, a stray dog that could potentially um cause him harm, versus a grown human that's going to be more cautious about it. And when you think about those trophy bass that are like, five, I mean, 9, 10 and plus pounds, I mean, if they're that big, it's because they live 15-20 years, however long they
Yeah,
live.
yeah,
They
they're
didn't
smart.
get to that point by being dumb.
Hmm.
Oftentimes you'll see, adolescent bass is more willing to attack. They got the energy, they got the inexperience against them, and they're more willing to try out, um, hitting that jackhammer that's, buzzing in front of him. Where a bigger bass, A, it moves slower, B, it doesn't have the same energy as a smaller bass, and C, it has more experience. It
Yeah,
kind
for
of
sure.
know it's kind of figure out when and where to attack, and when and where to just lock in and not, you know, not get caught. I
Yeah.
mean, that's why they made it so far.
Yeah, and the other thing I noticed too that this is kind of a little bit of a juicy piece of information that I mean I'm sure some people know about, but maybe not everyone knows about is from what I've seen in the Northeast, anywhere from like Onondaga Lake where I used to fish a ton back in New York to the Potomac River to down here, I saw it on Fairfield as well. Is most of the times whatever your predominant like nasty strong wind, there's almost always like a certain wind that is the predominant, like whenever the wind blows really hard it's usually going to come from that direction. And down here in Texas, it seems like it's usually that southwest west.
Yeah,
It seems like almost everywhere that's pretty like the weather seems to want to move across the US from west to east, so
yep,
usually it's that west southwest wind. The big bass especially are going to be protected from that wind because they know. And large like smallmouth are different. Smallmouth, they actually kind of like current. They don't mind current on their beds, so they're not necessarily always going to be protected from the wind because they actually don't mind that current. But largemouth typically don't like current, especially when they're spawning. And that strong wind is going to create current. It's going to create turbid water. It's going to stir up the bottom, potentially mess up their bed. So I saw it on Fairfield. Once I kind of keyed in onto that, I was like calling my shots. Like on the first day, I figured out they're spawning. Then I realized, oh, these bass are spawning in these pockets on the southwest side of the pockets. Like again, it's not going to be every single fish. You're going to have a couple stray ones that are going to be on the other side. Those are probably going to be the dumb ones, honestly. But once I figured that out, I was able to run these pockets, and literally I would be like, yep, there's going to be fish here, and I'd see one, catch it, run to the next pocket. Yep, see one, catch it. It's something I've seen all over the country.
and another thing that I've heard. Now, I can't speak to the truth of this because I mean, it takes years for you to kind of experience and do the research on this. But I've heard a lot of times in in podcasts and in fishing shows where they have somebody kind of talking about a certain topic. One of the things that I learned going to a boat show here in Fort Worth, they had this guy that he was talking about. I forgot his name. One of the fish used to fish the elites, but he mentioned something that I've never heard before. And again, I can't speak to the truth of it, but coming from a person that's actually fished in major events, um, one of the things he mentioned, if you find like most reservoirs are gonna have holding ponds, and for those that don't know or not familiar, maybe you're new to the sport. For those of you that done this for years, so excuse me, kind of mansplaining this. You probably know this, but if there's anybody listening or watching that is not that familiar with how this bass fishing works, this information may be for you. So whenever you have this man-made lakes, right? They dam the place, and then the water flow starts coming in until eventually it reaches its peak level. That's their pool level. Meanwhile, along the sides, you're gonna have this holding ponds, right? This ponds that when the water gets to that level, it's gonna be underwater. But for the most part, at until that time comes, they're gonna be used to put bass there and have them holding there versus just loading. It's kind of like a great way to load up a uh, a lake, a man-made lake, kind of like organically. Just have them at those various ponds along the edges, and eventually the water level will get up and they'll come in and out. Going back to that, a lot of bass, and again, I don't know the complete truth on this, but I've heard bass are similar to, like, say, salmon, where they migrate and then go back to their original uh, birthplace. And I've heard that bass continually, generation after generation, will go to wherever their ancestors spawned. Again, I'm not completely sure about that, but that's what I heard. Kind of makes sense considering that other fishing species do the same thing. So when you see these holding ponds and you can see them like on Google Maps, you can kind of figure out when you see this perfect circle, kind of like at the edge of a lake, you kind of figured out, okay, this was a holding pond. And sometimes you're completely underwater and you can see the edges while using your side scan. But if you find those pockets, a lot of times, and I noticed on Fairfield, there were some perfectly rounded pockets that I thought this was probably a holding pond. And that's where we found a lot of the bass that were spawning. And it makes sense because if that water level took like a year or so to get to where it is now, during that time, bass were spawning at that holding pond. So wherever they spawn, that first generation spawn, next generation is going to keep going back to that spot. And that's another interesting spot. So if you're fishing a lake and you know where there was a holding pond, start there because there might be just there. And if there was a big bass, it's going to be, that genetic of, the great grandpa bass, which, a 24 incher, then, those fry are going to have that same genetic.
Yeah,
Have,
yeah.
have you heard of that? And have you ever experienced something like that?
Yeah, I've definitely heard of fish going back to the areas they spawn from, and actually my degree's in aquatic and fisheries science, so I have a
Oh,
little bit
nice.
of fisheries background, and I was working for the USGS in upstate New York, and they were studying like whitefish and salmon. They were studying like what chemicals they cue in on that because they found that is the fact that they will go back to the exact creek that they had initially hatched from, and they wanted to figure out why. And they were looking at iodine and a couple other chemicals that they thought they were imprinting on, basically, that was causing them to go back to those areas. And I've definitely, in my opinion, seen it with smallmouth on the St. Lawrence River, where I think I've caught the same smallmouth like twice, like a year later in the same, like the exact same spot that fish bedded the year before. I personally think I've seen that happen up there. With largemouth, I don't know if I've seen it as much, but I also haven't spawned fish for largemouth as much as smallmouth, honestly. And but I think there's a lot of truth to that. And then as far as the holding pond thing, I've heard a lot of people say that fishing ponds is good down here. I don't know if always those ponds were initially built like to stock the lakes necessarily. Like I think a lot of these lakes down here were created due to dams being built, and so all these large areas were flooded. So I think part of it too is there was old farm ponds that used to just be part of these farmers' land
Yep.
that they had stocked with bass, and then once they got flooded over, those bass then got released into the lake. But like you said, because they want to go back to where they were initially hatched from, that causes them to keep going back to these ponds year after year to spawn, because that's where they initially were born from. So it's probably a little bit of both. Some of them were probably put there on purpose, and then some of them just so happen to be someone's backyard pond, that ended up becoming part of Lake Ray Roberts when they built the dam, and these fish are going back, year after year to spawn there.
Yeah, I'd seen like I know like Lake Grapevine, lake nearby where I live. I know a couple of spots where you can tell that that was a holding pond way before
Yeah,
the lake got to that level. And yes, I mean I haven't fished for spawning bass in Lake Grapevine because I don't go to that lake that much. It's a tough lake to fish, but you can definitely see, and I would definitely try to see, kind of experiment with that to see if you can. But again, that's something that takes time. Just because you found a bass there doesn't mean anything just other than it's spawning. Now, if you find it next year or and 2 and 3 years from now, then you get a clue of like, oh yeah, they do go back.
yeah,
But again, that's not something that you're going to learn overnight.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
going to take decades to really perfect that
yeah.
aspect of it.
And I think sometimes they use those ponds as staging areas too. Like I've heard of, I haven't really experienced it yet. I haven't been down here that long, obviously, but I've heard from a lot of people that on some of these bigger lakes, they'll use these ponds because they're nice, like they nice divots in the lake. Basically, it's somewhere they can just kind of tuck down into. A lot of times they hold bait, so there's food source for them. And as these fish are moving into the backs of creeks, they might make a little stop there, eat a little bit of shatter or whatever bait's in there, until they decide to pull up onto the spawning flat. And the other thing about these ponds is most of these ponds have dams as well, from when they were initially built. And sometimes those dams will have good rock on it. And whenever you're fishing pre-spawn bass, especially back in the Northeast too, largemouth, smallmouth, they're always going to look for that rock because rock holds warmth. So when the water temperature is still a little bit colder and you're getting these nice, hot sunny days, those areas that have the rock, that especially shallow rock, it's just going to hold warmth better, and it's going to hold crawfish, it's going to hold bait, and that's always something good to look for when you're looking for pre-spawn fish.
Definitely. I want to talk a little bit about the myth of spawning. And I wanted to start off with one specifically, and I'll get your feedback on this. I do believe lunar phase has some relevance into bass feeding. We see it, I used to live in Puerto Rico and I used to saltwater fish, and we see it in saltwater. I'm sure you'll see it in freshwater where, if you have a I'm sorry, a full moon, brighter night, you're gonna have bass that are gonna be up feeding all day and are gonna be more prone to feeding. One of the things that I think is, I want to say overrated, but blown out of proportion is how lunar phase translate to spawning bass. And in my opinion, I think it has little to no relevance at all. And I could be wrong, but I really don't see a connection with lunar phase and spawning bass. I really don't. I see a connection with lunar phase and feeding bass. When we're talking about spawning, in my opinion, a bass is going to spawn when it has sustained temperatures for a few days of like, that 60 to 65 degrees. Whatever the moon is doing at that time, it does not matter. It could be full moon, it could be a new moon. If the water temperature is right and it's been holding there for 2 or 3 days or more, bass are going to be spawning. And we saw it on Fairfield this weekend. We were shocked to see that in February 27th, there were so many spawning bass. And it was a new moon. There was no moon, in other words. We were the farthest we could be from a full moon on either side. And they were still spawning. Like, again, we can't say it's the vast majority of it because we don't know how many bass are in that lake. But what we can definitely say is there were hundreds of beds littering out there, the north side of the lake. What's your opinion on it? Do you really believe lunar phase has any influence on spawning bass?
Yeah, I would say I agree and I disagree with you at the same time. As far as the lunar phase having an impact on spawning bass, I think that it's not like they need that lunar phase to cause them to spawn. Like I think that if the conditions are on the verge, like let's say the water temp's like 57, 58, it's like not quite where it needs to be, and those fish are itching to get up there, and then there happens to be a full moon, I think that might cause a bunch of them to want to go up there, but I don't think it's necessary.
Yeah.
Like what we saw, obviously, there was no full moon, but that water temperature was getting up into that 60-degree range. So they're not going to sit around and wait for a full moon to get up there. They know, they're ready to go. So I think it can help push fish up to spawn, but I don't think it's necessary. And then as far as like the how the lunar phase affects how the fish are actually biting, I'm really not a believer in that at all. I think sometimes we overcomplicate things, and I think that sometimes we think there's a connection to something that's not actually there. I think like it's one of those scenarios where there's something else that caused those fish to bite, and it just so randomly happened to line up with the lunar phase that people are like, "Oh my god, it's the lunar phase." But like I've had buddies that will come out to me and try to tell me like, "Oh, today the fish are gonna bite because of this lunar phase," and then we don't catch shit. And then the next day, oh, the lunar phase is supposed to be terrible today, and we catch them good. I think there's many other factors that are way more important. I think people are just creating this, thing up that actually happens to be random or completely unrelated to the lunar phase and just randomly happen to line up with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree, and that's what I say. It has little to no relevance to it, and what we can both agree is that it's overstated. Let's
Yeah,
just say.
yeah, and I think I don't. I mean, I don't think there's really that many people out there in today's day and age that are like studying the lunar phase and planning their fishing trips around it. But
Yeah, go whenever you can go.
yeah, it's
I
definitely
am
not.
not gonna waste an opportunity to say I want to go fishing, but the lunar phase is gonna
Yeah,
suck, so I'm not going. I'm gonna if I got a chance to go, I go. Like I'm
yeah,
not gonna wait.
exactly.
What happens if the day that you have a great lunar phase happens to have thunderstorms,
Yeah.
and then you can't go? So there you go. You lost two
Yeah,
weeks.
I think there's other factors such as pressure changes. Like you get
Yeah.
a low pressure front coming in, that's always a really good feeding window typically. Different weather conditions, like in the pre-spawn, if you get a really hot sunny day that's calm, that's usually going to trigger a bunch of fish to push up shallow. There's so many other factors that are way more important. One other factor, I think this is kind of a random side tangent, but one other factor I think is kind of overlooked that's really important is stability in weather. I've seen it where you might have really crappy high pressure bluebird skies, but if you've had that weather pattern for 4 days in a row, usually on that fourth and fifth day, those fish are going to be biting really good because you've had that stable weather. Whereas if you have all these up and down pressure changes, low pressure, high pressure, low pressure for 4 days, sometimes that low pressure switch, they're actually not going to bite that good because the weather's been so all over the place. It makes them uncomfortable. That's my opinion on something I've noticed out there, and that's just an example of another factor that, in my opinion, is a lot more important to pay attention to as opposed to the moon phase.
That's a good point. So let me ask you this. I know this is not completely related to spawning, but I want to get more information on that because that's one thing that I don't feel comfortable talking on.
Yeah,
But
I
now
probably
that
should have said that. I'm kind of getting some juice out here.
but now that you mentioned it, like describe when we talk about low pressure and high pressure, what are we talking about exactly? Like how does one tell, okay, other than looking at an app, how does one tell that it's going to be a low pressure or high pressure day? And if you know, how does that
Yeah,
actually affect the bass?
yeah. I mean, kind of what I've always learned is that like a high pressure day is gonna equate to like they call it like a bluebird sky day, like a sunny hot day typically. Whereas like a low pressure day is going to be like a cloudier, windier type day. That's kind of how, I don't know if that's actually completely accurate or not. That's kind of how it's always been taught to me. Um, I think looking at an app is probably the best way to see it, but like usually if a storm's rolling in, usually that's low pressure that's rolling in. Whereas if it's, like I said, if it's been hot and sunny for a few days, that's usually high pressure. But I think looking at an app would probably be the most accurate way to look at it. But yeah, that's kind of how it's always been described to me.
Yeah, and it's interesting just because I think I learned that at Broken Bow, fishing the tournament this year. Like we had a morning that was like low pressure, then kind of high pressure towards the middle, and then kind of low pressure to the end. Everybody was thinking, oh, we need to get this low pressure for the bite to turn on again. And I really don't think it turns on that quick. And again, just because it's high pressure doesn't mean that you're not going to get a bite. It just means you may have to change your approach to a lower, smaller, simpler presentation.
Yeah.
Where bass is not going to be waste a lot of energy trying to get to your bait. That's really the nuts and bolts of it. Another thing that I wanted to touch on, because I think we overthink it.
Yeah, before we move on real quick, I want to
ahead.
go back to the pressure thing. Again, kind of going back to my science background, but how the pressure changes has been described to me. I can't really remember exactly where I saw this, but fish rely on their swim bladders pretty heavily to, to navigate water. It's almost like a sensory organ for them. And when that pressure changes, they feel it in their swim bladder, and they have to adjust their swim bladder to the pressure change. So when you have a really drastic pressure change, they're going to feel that, and a lot of times it's going to make them uncomfortable, or it might cause them to feed drastically for an hour, and then all of a sudden they're going to get uncomfortable and they're going to shut down. So that goes back to, again, why I said stability in weather sometimes can actually be the best thing for fish to bite, because the pressure's been the same for a few days, the weather's been the same. It allows that fish to equalize everything. They're comfortable. Everything feels right, and it causes them to get into that feeding mood.
Yeah, I think that, and that's the key. I think a lot of times it's not. Yeah, it does affect, like we mentioned, high pressure and all that, but I think the main thing is sustained.
Yeah.
When something is sustained, they'll adapt. They're like, okay, now I'm 2 or 3
They're
days of this.
comfortable. Yeah, they're like, all right,
now I'm
it's been the same.
comfortable. Yeah, I can get into my feeding habits.
Yeah, I'm not uncomfortable anymore. I'm willing to go out and munch this Senko real quick.
Yeah. So another thing that I wanted to touch on, and this is sometimes we overcomplicate this so much. And one thing I've learned over the last few seasons of targeting bass on spawning, on bedding fish, the only thing you need, man, and I'll say this to anybody that's listening: get a pack of Senkos or something cheaper. That's the other thing. I'm gonna go on a rabbit hole over here. I was stocking up for my tournament at Kato. Ah, damn, the Yamamoto Senkos are like almost $9, and then you see the Yum Dingers at $2.99, and I'm like, wait a minute. For 4 packs of Yum Dingers, it's a pack of like what am I doing here? I know it has a little. I think the quantity in the package is a little bit smaller, but still, it's like, seriously. I was talking to the cashier, and he was telling me like, oh no, for practice I'll throw the Yum Dinger, and for the tournaments throws the Senko, and I was like, the bass doesn't know if it's a Senko or a Yum Dinger. But I mean, maybe there's something different. But honestly, man, they are way overpriced. So we went to Fairfield, and this is what I'm going back to my subject here. The only thing you need is a Senko, man. And I would say, my advice: use a 4-inch Senko. Stop using the 6-inch Senko. My experience with that is, the bass are not, if they're bedding, they're not going to necessarily eat it. They're just going to grab it and dump it out of their bed. So you want your hook to, get like 50% of that bait. So that's why I started using a 3/0 hook, I think, on a 4-inch Senko, where the hook really, 3/4 of the end of that hook is like 3/4 into that bait. So even if they must catch it like really right in the tip for me not able to set that hook. And we tried different things. And I was like, I go back to this, man. If you're bed fishing, just throw a weightless Senko, 4-inch weightless Senko, 3/0 hook. That's all you need. Nothing is going to work better than that.
Yeah.
Not to say they won't bite anything else, but it's really, what's your favorite bait for bed fishing? Let me ask you.
Yeah, I agree with you. First off, I think you're right. I think if you're a beginner and you want to go bed fish, I think get yourself a weightless Senko. 4-inch Senko is perfect. Get a bright color so you can see it pretty good.
Yeah.
And go to work. But I was being really stubborn that morning because I was throwing the bigger Senko, the 5-inch, and I had a weight on it because that's what I was catching on the day before. But they were a lot more aggressive the day before, where first flip they'd bite it. This day they were more pressured, and I wasn't getting bit hardly at all. Whereas Armando was coming up behind me on the same beds, throwing that weightless 4-inch Senko, and they'd bite it instantly. And you can ask Armando about it, but he was loving it. He was loving every second of
I
it.
there was a point where I was like, this is my last day on Caleb's boat. There is no way Caleb is gonna ever invite me on his boat again. And for those that are watching or listening, we'll give you the story. So we're into bed fishing. Obviously, it's Caleb. It's Caleb's boat, so he's gonna, he has the lion's share of the spots, right? I'm just flipping behind it. I'll try to cast into some other spot, so I won't be fishing behind it. But when you see all these beds and all this bass, since he's not catching them, I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna fish behind him. And he kept changing baits and throwing different things. And I just kept throwing that 4-inch Senko and I kept hooking into them. And I was like, don't say anything. Don't troll him. Don't say anything. And about the fourth one, by now I got 4 and Caleb has like 0. And I
I
was
think I
like,
lost
okay.
one.
Yeah, I was
I think
like,
I
okay,
lost
I gotta troll him now. I gotta troll him now and just bite the bullet. Temptation is too much. Just understand that this is the last time I'm going to Caleb's boat. How, and I have to ask you now, like, you can be honest, how frustrating was it for you to watch me just pick apart these beds that you were trying so hard and couldn't get a bite, and here I am just picking them apart right behind you? Did that frustrate you at all?
Honestly, it really wasn't frustrating at all for me. Like, I'm a really competitive person, so the competitive aspect of it, like, yeah, I was like, man, he's smoking me right now from the back. So that part of it bothered me, but it didn't frustrate me because my whole thing is I always like to learn. Every time I'm on the water, when I'm not in a tournament, like if I was in a tournament, yeah, and you were my co-angler, by the second one you hooked, you better believe I would have had a 4-inch weightless Senko on. Because I'm not gonna get, I'm gonna adapt obviously, and that's one of the most important things about when you're tournament fishing or fishing in general is you can't live in the past. So what I was doing and what was wrong was I kept trying to force what happened the day before. Whereas if I really wanted to catch them, I had to adapt and change to the conditions that were presented to me. But again, like I was saying, I'm the type of person where I'm always trying to learn something. So
Yeah.
rather than just copy what you're doing, and yes, I knew I would actually catch more fish by doing that. I was like, you know what, I'm gonna keep doing this and let's just like treat this like a study. Like, am I actually gonna be able to get any of these fish like this, or is he really gonna outfish me, 4-1 in this scenario? And obviously, you had proved that you caught a lot more than me. But right there, I learned something. I learned
Yeah.
that next, if I'm ever in a tournament scenario like that where the bedfish are pressured, don't be stubborn. Don't try to force feed them what was happening in practice. Just throw in that little weightless Senko, or even I'm sure even a Ned rig or something like that would have
Yeah.
worked really well. I did try a drop shot at one point, and I know that would have worked, but it was too hard for me to get the right cast because of the weeds, and I was too lazy to tie a Texas rig going on where it kept getting snagged. So I got pretty frustrated with that pretty quickly. But going back to what you had initially asked me, what my favorite bed bait is, I agree with you. I think a Senko is one of the best, but it also depends if you're talking smallmouth or largemouth.
Yeah.
If I'm fishing for smallmouth, a drop smallmouth are, I mean, they're easy to catch off bed. It's almost like not even fair. Drop shot works really well for a smallmouth on a bed. Usually they're going to be deeper. That's part of why a drop shot works better. A Ned rig is also one of my go-tos. Bright colors I think are important so you can see them. One thing I'll say about bed fishing is once you see that fish, it sees you. So at
Yeah.
that point, unless it's a super fresh, super unpressured fish or a smallmouth, that's completely different. They're going to bite no matter what. They just get so pissed. If it's a largemouth and it sees you, it's probably not going to bite unless you really finesse it. So again, try that weightless Senko or back off. And this is where, I haven't done it a ton. It's something I'm trying to learn how to do. I see a lot of guys do it where they'll use just a white crawl on
I've
a
done that. Yeah.
Texas rig hook with a bullet weight because you can see it really well. And it's just something that's going to be digging in their eggs and it's just going to get them riled up. So basically, if that fish already sees you, at that point they're not going to bite first flip. You have to get that fish really, really pissed off in order to get to bite. So there's a few different ways you can do that, such as knocking it with your line, just repeatedly every bed has a sweet spot is another thing I've learned. Like there's that one little spot where most of the eggs are sitting. And if you repeatedly keep hitting that sweet spot, the fish is going to give you signs that it's starting to get annoyed. It's going to start doing fast circles. It's going to start flaring its gills, and eventually it's going to get so mad it's just going to have to bite basically. And it could take hours sometimes, especially on a big one. Every fish is different. Some fish are more locked in the bed than others, and those are always the easiest ones
Yeah.
to catch. But kind of went on a little bit of a tangent there, but yeah,
No, that's good. Yeah, I noticed that.
I guess yeah, Senkos are my favorite.
Yeah, and going back to what you said, I learned this from Dustin Black. Dustin Black is a guide fishing in Lake Fork. He actually built my kayak trailer, and we went pre-fishing. No, pre-fishing. We went spawning last year, or what am I saying? We went fishing for spawning bass
You went
last year.
spawning.
Yeah, that sounded horrible, but that really sounded horrible. Anyways, we went fishing for spawning or bedding bass, and we couldn't get them to bite. They were high pressured. We went to Lake Fork, and then we went to another lake. Can't remember the name of it. It's a small lake. I think it's something like Hubbard. It's not Ray Hubbard. It's another name. Anyways, small lake. We can see them, but they were really exposed. So I'm sure everybody and their mother had come in and and fish those spawning bass. But one thing he taught me is like it's like to piss him off. He was like, just piss him off. I'm like, what are you talking about, Justin? Like I'm trying. He's not. What do you mean? And he would tie in a little heavier weight and we just throw it in there, smack it on his face, with it, which is kind of cruel. And he would also put it on the middle. And what he would do is when the bass is nosing them, if it's not biting, he would, lift that rod tip and hit the bass with the bullet weight. And then the bass, you see them, they flare up.
Yeah.
They're super mad. I would see them because it was crystal clear water. And it was so funny to watch this bass just completely pissed off, just like very aggressive, swimming towards it and not biting it and just flaring their gills until eventually they're like, they can't take it anymore. Yeah. They're stressed out and they would eventually bite the lure. But it's funny. I've never seen that before. And I learned that from him to like, if it's staying on the bed, but it's not biting it, just keep throwing it out there until you piss him off. Just hit him with it. And I was like, it's kind of cruel, but it does work. And one thing that you mentioned, and I've seen that too. I actually got a reel on that on Instagram where we were trying to get this bass and it wouldn't bite. Finally, I threw in on a spinning setup a weightless Rage Menace, white Rage Menace. So it's kind of like a white craw. And as soon as that got in, immediately smoked it. I set the hook, lost it. Next cast, I flipped it in again, and it did not hesitate. There was something about that white rage tail craw imitation that it did not like it on the bed. So even though I still think Senkos are the goats when it comes to spawning bass, that for whatever reason they really did not like that rage tail menace, especially the white one. They just does not like it.
I like a jig too. Is one of my other favorite baits for spawning bass, especially on a lake that has a lot of bluegill around. A swim jig can be extremely effective around the spawn, especially when you're trying to make long casts to where you can't actually see the bed. You're just trying to fish for spawning fish. I've had a lot of instances where a swim jig works really well because it just looks like a bluegill that's coming near the bed. Yep. And usually if that bass can't see you, they're actually going to be pretty aggressive and they're going to bite what you throw at them. So it's just a really effective way to cover water and fish for spawning fish you can't see. And then at the same time, if you become within range of one that you can see, you can flip that swim jig to the bed, and usually that works pretty well for getting reaction out of them.
Yeah, I want to share another little nugget that I found out that I learned last year. But before we do that, we're almost to the end of the show. I know there's a lot of people. There's a few people connected on YouTube and Facebook. If you have any questions about spawning and you want to ask Caleb or I, feel free to put it on the comment section. And let me make sure I'm looking at the comments here. And then feel free to ask the questions and we'll post your question and have Caleb answer it if we can answer it. But one thing that I learned also when we were targeting this spawning bass that we just did not want to bite, for whatever reason, it came to my head that I would throw in a jointed swim bait, that Mike Buka. And this was a lake that was not really a lot of shad. I think their main forage was bluegill. So I had this Mike Buka jointed swim bait bluegill pattern. And I flipped it just like it was a jig. And then immediately both the female and the male bass attacked it. And to me, that speaks to like, okay, they're used to now maybe 5 people before us for the last couple of days have been throwing jigs, Senkos, whatever. But nobody thought about throwing bluegill pattern swim bait, and it wasn't a big one. And immediately they went berserk on it. It only took like 2 seconds on the water for that thing to bite. And again, I got the reel on Instagram on that one. But that's another thing. It's like thinking. I'm sorry, outside the box. And when you say outside the box, again, if Senko's not working, if the traditional baits are not working, what else can you throw that's completely different? And my thought was like, this place is full of bluegill, and bluegill will feed on unattended bass eggs and fry. They will definitely. So my thought was, if they see a bluegill next to their nest, they're gonna attack it because they're gonna think, oh, they're coming for our eggs. There's no way they don't attack it. If they don't attack it, they're bad parents.
Yeah, bass,
So
especially largemouth, cannot stand bluegill during this point.
yeah. So that's another. Now it's a lot harder to cast like something with a treble hook, especially when it's protected by grass. But that thing, as soon as it hit the water, it didn't get like 1 inch below the surface before they annihilated. It was almost like hitting top water.
Yeah.
But Caleb, again, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm glad you survived the storms, man. You were. This is your first Texas real thunderstorm. How was it?
This is my second one because
Oh, your second one?
There was one back in November when I first moved here. That
All right.
there's some tornadoes that were pretty close on that one, but I think this one was a little bit worse maybe as far as the storm itself. But we didn't get any tornadoes that ended up touching down near me. But yeah, I survived, man. My camper's still here. Didn't get swept away in the wind.
Yeah, it's funny because you and I talking, for those out there that are watching or listening, just like from 6 to 6:30, we're expected to be hit bad, like 80 mile per hour winds. And Caleb, you call me, it's like, are we still doing the live show? I'm like it's Texas. It'll come and go in 15, 20, 30 minutes. As long as it doesn't take out electricity and the internet service. And thankfully it didn't, but it was just like that. It was just like
Yeah.
30 minutes of sure
But-
terror.
Yep.
Then all of a sudden we're back to beautiful evening, cool evening. But
Yeah,
thank you so much. I'm glad you survived.
I think
you in a
people-
camper.
I think people in Texas were more worried about it than I was because I had a couple people down here that live down here that called me like, "You all right, man? You really gonna sit in your camper during this?" I'm like, "Bro, like it's not that big a deal. I'll be fine."
No, and I forgot you lived in a camper. So when you called me, I was like, yeah, no, it's me. I get it. You're not from Texas. You don't understand. But I was like, oh, no, wait, you live in a camper. So you might have to. And that's why I told you, no, dude, if you need to get out of there, get out of there. I completely forgot that you lived in a camper. We were talking about it. And I was like, I am coming like so unsensitive, like a jerk right now. Like I don't care about Caleb. And it's just that I forgot he lives on a camper, which is not where you want to be on a.
Worst, like absolute worst case scenario, they do have a storm shelter at this campground I'm staying at, but I don't know. I wasn't too worried about it. I was watching, just making sure. If I saw a tornado that was within 5 miles of me or something, like you better believe I'd be in that storm shelter. But it nothing ended up happening, so we were all good.
So Caleb, before I let you go, I do love asking this kind of like random fun questions. And I wanted to do this. It's gonna be word association. So I'll give you, in relation to fishing, think about fishing. I'll give you a word and you tell me the first thing that comes into your mind.
Okay, real quick before we do it, I
Yeah.
just want to give a plug to
Oh yeah, go ahead.
real quick for I have a YouTube channel as well. Probably
Oh,
should
yeah.
have done this at the beginning, but CK Fishing. I've been posting a ton of videos on it. Been keeping up with weekly uploads, putting out a lot of Texas content and some New York content as well. A lot of straight up fishing is what I've been posting lately, but I have some really cool stuff planned out for the next few weeks. A couple like different lake breakdowns and how-tos that are coming. So got some really cool content I'm gonna be putting up there. Definitely check me out, CK Fishing. Subscribe if you haven't already, and stay tuned for some dope stuff coming your way.
Yeah, we got the last 2 days at Fairfield before they close, and that's a banger video.
That's gonna be a dude 7-pounder on film. That's gonna
we
be,
got 2, right?
Yeah, and then you got your 6.5 on film too. So that's gonna be pretty sick.
Yeah. So go subscribe. What's the handle again on it?
CK Fishing.
And other than YouTube, where can people follow you?
I got a Instagram, Caleb Konrad Fishing, and Facebook as well, Caleb Konrad Fishing. I think I'm gonna begin on TikTok here soon. I've been thinking about it for a while, and I think I got to stop being a boomer and adjust to the next gen.
Dude, the thing about TikTok is, I don't know what is it about the reels, but it is just so addicting. Like I'll spend some like I'll give you a funny anecdote on this. So my wife was getting her nails done, and I'm looking at the weather. I'm like, man, she's not home, and this thunderstorm's about to hit. So let me call her. So I grab my phone and I get a TikTok notification. 30 minutes later, I'm still watching
You
TikTok
never called
reels, and I never called her to tell her, hey, you need to get home. It's about a thunderstorm's about to hit us. So it would have been kind of not funny if if she would have been swept away by a tornado, all because I went to the TikTok rabbit hole when I picked up my phone to call her and tell her to
That's
come
pretty
home.
funny. That's pretty funny.
It is, but anyway, it is funny because nothing happened. But
Yeah.
anyways, all right. First word, overrated. What comes to mind?
Overrated. Oh, wow, I'm trying. That's a good one. I'm trying to think. Overrated.
I know I came strong from the get go.
Yeah, that was tough. Um, what's overrated? Paying attention to the moon cycle.
There we go. It goes full circle. That's what I should have
Sorry,
left
it
for
took
the
me a
end.
while. I know I'm supposed to say the first thing that comes to mind, but I didn't, we're live, so I gotta keep it.
So, um, goat.
Currently, I'm gonna have to say Jacob Wheeler. Honestly, I know I'm gonna get some hate for that, but
Hey, it's your opinion. It's your opinion. First words come to mind. No judgment here. Bladed jigs.
bladed jigs, jackhammer,
Smallmouth bass.
smallmouth Disneyland, taku time.
Ray Roberts. Well, that's two words, but you do it.
Grind. That place is freaking brutal.
Um, underrated.
Underrated. Martin Villa. That dude's a
There you go.
hammer. That dude's an absolute hammer. He might be the GOAT right now, and people don't even know about it.
There you go. Man, what's another one I can think of? Ned Riggs.
Smallmouth destroyers, man. I mean, that's one of my favorite smallmouth baits.
Douglas.
Phenomenal rods. Some of probably the best. Yeah, definitely the best rods I've ever used. Fred Contawi, he's a freaking magician, man. He's a mastermind.
Yeah. I'll leave it. I'll end it with that one. But I do want to take a note on this because people, uh, sometimes ask me like Douglas Rod. They're my sponsors. Do I really like the rods? And I get it. A lot of content creators. You have to pick and choose, and sometimes you have to make decisions on who's going to be your sponsor and all that. What I can say about Douglas Rod, and I'm never going to be that type of content creator, sponsor or not, that it's going to tell you like minimize your fishing ability if if not using this rod kind of thing. Like I hear a lot, this is the best rods in the world. Or if you're not serious about fishing, if you're not using this rod, it's kind of or X product. I think that's disrespectful. I think rods, reels, it's what you're confident in. I can't say that Douglas is the best rods in the world because I don't know how other rods were being built. But I can say this, and Caleb, you can back me up on this. You and I have met Fred Contai. Fred Contai designs the rod. We know why, and one of the reasons why I love this Douglas rods is because I know Fred Contai. I don't know who the rod designer for G Loomis is. I don't know who the rod designer for St. Croix is. They could be great at what they're doing, but I know Fred Contai, and I know how stingy he is with quality. I know what a perfectionist he is. I know how much work and love he puts in designing every specific rod for every specific scenario. And knowing that gives me complete confidence, whether I'm sponsored by them or not, that I would be using Douglas rods. Maybe until the day Fred Contai leaves. If Fred Contai says, "Hey, I'm retiring, I'm not doing it," maybe I'll try something different. But as long as he's there, just knowing what I know about him and having a relationship with him, being friends and knowing what he's all about and how much thought he puts into this process, just gives me a complete confidence that I know I have some of the best rods in the world.
Yeah, they're truly phenomenal rods, and yeah, I used to work for them. I worked for about a year and a half doing sales for them, and got to see all the ins and outs of everything, how they're made, Fred's a good buddy of mine, Kevin Johnson, some really great people at Douglas. And like you said, I mean, the attention that Fred puts on these things, he blows my mind with the way he's like a mad scientist,
Yeah,
truly.
that's what I call him here. Yeah.
And he designs these rods, every single one from the ground up. And like when I was reeling in that 7-pounder, not the one I caught at Fairfield, but the one I caught at Ray Roberts a few weeks ago, it was on a crankbait, man, on the light, like a moderate fast rod on 10-pound line. And I had the utmost confidence in my rod that if I just took my time and let the rod play the fish, I was going to get that fish in the boat. I mean, it's having confidence in your gear is huge, especially when you're a serious fisherman or a tournament fisherman. And Douglas Rods definitely does that for me. So, yeah, no complaints whatsoever. I love them.
There you go. So go check them out. For those out there listening or watching, just remember, if you're listening on an MP3 format, we do appreciate if you leave us your 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Amazon Music, or whatever podcast platform or streaming service you use. If you're going to be on the water, I always tell this, and I'm sure some of you are sick of me saying this, please wear your PFDs. If you're going to be on the water, have a couple of beers, please drink responsibly. Make sure you make it home back safe. So thank you for tuning in. Remember, the Advanced Kayak Angler every Wednesday morning. We have a great episode coming on next Wednesday, so come check it out. Yeah, for those that are going to be fishing the Caddo tournament at the Hobie BOS, good luck, and to everyone, stay safe. Also, the Guntersville Bassmaster Kayak Series Trail, good luck to everybody fishing it. I hope everybody stays safe. Have a great day, everyone. Peace out.